What if Donald Trump has just made one mistake too many against Iran? For days now, tensions have been rising, threats have been escalating, and behind closed doors, some American officials are already talking about a worst-case scenario. Because behind the tough rhetoric, there is a much more alarming reality. Iran is not Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It is not Gaddafi's Libya. And today, several military experts believe that some of Trump's decisions could produce the exact opposite of what he is trying to achieve. Uncontrolled escalation, regional war, exploding oil prices, indirect attacks against American interests. What is most surprising is that some of these mistakes were entirely predictable. So, what are Trump's 6 fatal mistakes against Iran? And why could this strategy become one of the riskiest gambles of his political career? Trump's first mistake, and probably the most dangerous one, was believing Iran would eventually surrender under pressure. For years, the American strategy has been based on a simple idea: apply so much economic pressure that the Iranian regime eventually breaks. Massive sanctions, diplomatic isolation, military threats, financial pressure. On paper, the strategy seems logical, except for one fundamental detail that many Western leaders have repeatedly underestimated. Iran does not react like most countries. The Iranian regime was built through confrontation. Since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the country has lived under constant tension with the United States. And over the decades, Tehran has learned how to turn external pressure into an internal political weapon. The more Washington threatens Iran, the more the regime uses those threats to strengthen its authority at home. This is a critical mechanism to understand, because while many expected the regime to weaken or collapse, Iran instead developed a deep culture of resistance. The country survived a devastating war with Iraq, decades of economic sanctions, covert operations, the assassinations of scientists and military officials. And despite all of that, the regime is still standing. That is exactly what makes Trump's calculation far riskier than it appears. Because the government in Tehran is not simply trying to avoid confrontation, it sees the standoff with the United States as a matter of political and ideological survival. And in that context, every American threat can produce the opposite effect. Instead of weakening the regime, it can strengthen the hardest factions inside Iran. The factions that have argued for years that the United States will never truly seek compromise. This is why many analysts describe it as a major strategic mistake. Trump appeared to believe that a powerful show of force would be enough to make Iran back down. But recent history shows the exact opposite. Several times when American pressure intensified, Iran responded with even more provocations: accelerated nuclear enrichment, greater support for regional allies, military demonstrations, threats around the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, the more pressure rises, the higher the risk of escalation becomes. And the problem for Washington is that once this cycle begins, it becomes extremely difficult to step back without appearing politically weak. That is what worries several former American military officials today, because they understand that a cornered country can become far more unpredictable. And in Iran's case, that unpredictability could quickly move far beyond diplomacy. The real danger may be this: Trump believed he was applying maximum pressure, but he may actually have created a situation where Iran feels it has very little left to lose. Trump's second major mistake was presenting Iran as isolated, weakened, and surrounded. On the surface, that idea seems true. Iran's economy is under severe pressure. American sanctions have hit the country hard. Massive inflation, a weakened currency, falling foreign investment, growing frustration among parts of the population. From Washington's perspective, many believed Iran had become vulnerable. But strategically, the reality is far more complex. Because Iran's influence extends far beyond its borders, for years, Tehran has built a vast network of alliances and armed groups throughout the region. And that is precisely what makes the country extremely difficult to confront. Unlike a conventional military power, Iran does not rely solely on its official army. The regime has developed what many experts call an indirect influence strategy. In other words, projecting power without necessarily entering direct war itself. This is where the situation becomes dangerous, because in the event of escalation with Washington, Tehran has multiple ways to ignite the entire region. In Lebanon, through Hezbollah. In Iraq, through several armed groups aligned with Iran. In Syria, where Tehran still maintains a major strategic presence. In Yemen, through the Houthis, who are capable of disrupting key maritime routes. And this network completely changes the rules of the game, because the United States could strike Iran directly, without ever fully controlling the indirect consequences. That is the real problem. An attack on Tehran could trigger chain reactions that are impossible to fully predict. American military bases targeted, ships attacked, oil routes threatened, strikes against U.S. allies in the region. And the more geographically spread the conflict becomes, the harder it becomes to control politically and militarily. That is exactly what many American strategists fear. Because Iran has studied modern warfare carefully, the regime understands that it likely cannot defeat the United States in a direct military confrontation. So it plays by different rules: attrition, multiple fronts, indirect pressure, long-term destabilization. And in this kind of conflict, even the world's strongest military power can become trapped. That is what makes Trump's strategy so risky, because it sometimes assumes Iran is an isolated adversary that can simply be intimidated into submission, when in reality, Tehran still possesses enormous regional leverage, and the higher the tensions rise, the greater the risk of a regional spillover becomes. Because in the Middle East, conflicts rarely remain confined to a single country. And that is exactly what could transform a confrontation with Iran into a major regional crisis. Trump's third mistake may have been transforming this confrontation with Iran into a permanent political spectacle. Because with Trump, everything revolves around power projection, communication, dominance, political image. And for years, that strategy often allowed him to control the political narrative in the United States. But against Iran, this logic becomes far more dangerous. Why? Because in the Middle East, words can sometimes carry as much weight as weapons. Every statement is analyzed. Every threat is interpreted. Every public declaration can instantly raise tensions. And the problem is that Trump often uses extremely direct, sometimes brutal rhetoric. Annihilation, massive retaliation, consequences like never before. This kind of language may impress part of the American public, but against a regime like Tehran's, it can also produce the opposite effect, because Iran's leadership cannot afford to appear weak in front of the United States. It is a matter of political survival. And this is where the trap begins. The more Trump publicly escalates his rhetoric, the more Iranian leaders feel forced to respond aggressively as well. Otherwise, they risk appearing to surrender under American pressure. As a result, both sides begin playing a dangerous game where neither wants to lose face. And historically, that is exactly how major crises spiral out of control. One statement leads to a threat. The threat leads to a response. The response leads to further escalation. And gradually, leaders become trapped inside their own logic of confrontation. The problem with this kind of dynamic is that eventually, backing down becomes politically expensive. Very expensive. Trump built much of his political image around the idea that he never backs down, that he hits harder, that he dominates his opponents. But against Iran, that posture can become a strategic trap, because once the crisis becomes tied to personal credibility, the space for negotiation shrinks dramatically. And that is exactly what worries many former American diplomats. In these types of crises, leaders sometimes need to leave discreet exit doors open for the other side in order to avoid uncontrolled escalation. But when everything becomes public, dramatic, and highly mediatized, those exit doors slowly disappear. And the higher the media pressure rises, the greater the risk of miscalculation becomes. Faulty intelligence, a misunderstood strike, an attack carried out by an allied militia, a rushed response. And suddenly, both sides can find themselves pulled far beyond what they originally intended. That is precisely what many military experts fear, because a crisis does not need to be intentionally started in order to spiral out of control. Sometimes, all it takes is for two powers to simultaneously refuse to show any sign of weakness. And in the case of Trump versus Iran, that may be exactly what is happening. Trump's fourth mistake may have been underestimating the massive economic consequences that a confrontation with Iran could trigger. Because this is not only about geopolitics, it is about money, energy, global trade, and ultimately the daily lives of millions of people. That is what many people forget when tensions rise in the Middle East. Every major crisis in the region eventually creates consequences far beyond Iran itself. And Iran holds an extremely sensitive strategic lever: its geographic position. The country sits at the heart of one of the world's most critical oil transit zones, with one key choke point constantly watched by global markets: the Strait of Hormuz. A tiny passage on the map, but a massive artery for the global economy. A huge portion of the world's seaborne oil shipments passes through this narrow corridor. And the moment tensions rise, markets react immediately. Why? Because even the threat of instability in that area can send oil prices soaring worldwide. A full-scale war is not even necessary. Direct confrontation is not even necessary. The mere possibility of disruption is enough to shake the global economy. And that is exactly what concerns many economists today, because a prolonged spike in energy prices could become politically explosive for Western governments. Higher fuel prices, more expensive transportation, rising inflation, pressure on businesses, higher food costs. In other words, a crisis with Iran could quickly move beyond the military sphere and directly affect ordinary people. And the problem for Trump is that the economy is always politically sensitive, especially at a time when many households are already struggling with the cost of living. This is why some analysts describe it as a strategic miscalculation, because by trying to project maximum strength against Tehran, Trump could also trigger an economic instability that becomes difficult to contain. And the longer the tensions last, the more nervous investors become. Markets hate uncertainty. And a potential Middle East conflict represents exactly the kind of scenario capable of provoking global chain reactions. Stock market declines, rising maritime insurance costs, slower international trade, pressure on key commodities, and above all, a growing climate of economic fear. That is what makes this situation particularly dangerous, because modern wars are no longer fought only with missiles and fighter jets. They are also fought in banks, on financial markets, at gas stations, and in consumer confidence. The paradox is that even without launching a major war, Iran can already inflict significant economic damage simply by maintaining constant pressure in the region. And that may be where Trump underestimated his opponent, because in this kind of confrontation, military power alone does not guarantee control over the consequences, especially when the global economy itself becomes an indirect battlefield. And this may be the hardest mistake to recognize, because it is not about missiles, not about sanctions, not even about American military power itself. It is about the very nature of the conflict. Trump appears to have approached this confrontation through a classic logic. The world's strongest military power applies pressure, and eventually the opponent backs down. Except against Iran, that logic can become dangerously misleading. Because Tehran does not need to defeat the United States militarily in order to turn this crisis into a strategic victory. And that is the real trap. Iran fully understands that it likely cannot defeat the American military in a conventional war. Its leaders know it. Its military commanders know it. But that may not even be the objective. The objective could be much simpler and much more dangerous. Make the crisis last. Exhaust the opponent. Multiply the tensions. Increase the political, economic, and military costs for Washington. Because in this type of confrontation, time itself becomes a weapon. And recent American history reveals something important. Long wars often end up weakening Washington politically. Iraq, Afghanistan, conflicts where American military superiority was overwhelming, but where exhaustion gradually transformed military victories into political burdens. That is exactly the type of dynamic Iran could try to reproduce on another scale. Not necessarily through total war, not through constant direct confrontation, but through continuous pressure. Diffuse, persistent, exhausting, with recurring crises capable of maintaining instability for months, even years. And the longer this situation continues, the more risks begin to emerge simultaneously. Fatigue among the American public, divisions among Western allies, economic fragility, permanent military tension across the region, and above all, a growing risk of human error. Because in a high-tension environment, sometimes a single incident is enough to trigger uncontrollable escalation. A drone shot down, a strike wrongly attributed, an attack carried out by an allied militia, a misreading of intelligence, and suddenly, both sides can find themselves dragged into an escalation neither truly intended at the beginning. That is precisely what worries many military experts, because the more indirect confrontations multiply, the harder it becomes to know who is truly controlling the situation. Meanwhile, Iran can continue exploiting another critical weapon: international perception. Because in this kind of crisis, winning does not necessarily mean destroying your opponent militarily. Sometimes simply surviving is enough, showing resilience, remaining standing under American pressure. Symbolically, that alone can already be presented by Tehran as a political victory. And that is where Trump's calculation becomes extremely risky. Because by trying to demonstrate overwhelming power, he may ultimately give Iran exactly what the regime needs to strengthen its narrative. The narrative of a country under siege, but still standing. And the longer the crisis lasts, the more credible that possibility becomes. Because in the Middle East, the most dangerous conflicts are not always the ones that explode immediately. They are often the ones that slowly settle in, until the moment when nobody can truly stop them anymore.